Do you ever wonder what hurts more, being forgotten or being quietly replaced? I used to think time heals everything, but now I know. Time doesn't heal, it reveals. It shows you who truly cared and who only stayed because it was convenient. Before I begin, thank you for choosing to spend a little piece of your night with me. If it's not too much to ask, would you mind telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there? Sometimes I imagine my story traveling across oceans, someone listening at dawn, another before sleep, and somehow that thought makes all the loneliness I once felt a little softer. My name is Eleanor Ward, and this is the story of how silence became my only way of speaking. The day my own son-in-law called me a burden, and life taught him what real weight feels like. I was never the kind of woman who depended on others. When my husband, Thomas, passed away, people whispered that I wouldn't manage alone. They didn't know me well. I had run a company beside him for 25 years. A small real estate firm that grew from one dusty office to 5 branches. We didn't have wealth in the glamorous sense. No yachts, no servants, but we had peace. And we built that peace together, brick by brick. When he died, our daughter Lydia insisted I move in with her and her husband, Ethan. She said, "Mom, it'll make me feel better knowing you're not alone." I hesitated. Something in her tone felt more like responsibility than love. But I agreed, partly because I didn't want her to worry, partly because I couldn't stand the quiet of an empty house. The first few weeks were fine. Ethan was polite, even charming in that corporate way. The kind of man who compliments out of habit more than heart. He'd say things like, "Mrs. Ward, you make a great cup of tea," or "It's nice having you around." But soon, the tone changed. It started with small remarks. When I'd switch off lights in empty rooms, he'd say, "You don't need to save every penny, Eleanor. We're not living in the 80s." When I'd fold laundry or offer to cook, he'd laugh softly. "Mom, relax. We can afford help." The word afford always lingered in the air. Like a badge he wanted me to see. Lydia was caught in the middle, always smiling nervously, always trying to smooth the edges. But love makes people blind, and her blindness was loyal. Ethan loved to be admired. He'd talk about his company, his clients, his business trips. Always I, never we. One night at dinner, I mentioned how Thomas and I used to manage property sales during recessions. Ethan smirked and said, "That was a different world, Eleanor. You built things slow. Now it's about speed, not patience." He said it with that polite cruelty that doesn't sound offensive until you sit alone and replay it in your head. I laughed it off. I always did. But there's something about constant little humiliations. They don't explode. They seep in. Day after day, you shrink a little. And one morning, you wake up realizing you've become invisible in a home you once thought would be your comfort. Then came the evening that changed everything. It was Lydia's birthday. I had spent the whole day preparing, baking her favorite lemon tart, arranging flowers, wrapping a gift I'd chosen weeks ago. Guests began arriving, the house filled with chatter and perfume and laughter. And then I overheard him. Ethan was standing in the kitchen with one of his colleagues, glass in hand, laughing softly. "She's sweet, but honestly, it's exhausting having her around." Lydia won't say it, but her mother's presence makes the place feel stuck in time. Every decision has to be filtered through what would Mom think. It's like living with an echo. His friend chuckled. Then Ethan added, "I'm trying to convince her that her mom should move to a retirement villa, somewhere peaceful. I mean, we're starting a family. We need space. Financially, it's just too much now. Financially." That word hit harder than insult. I stood there, frozen, holding a tray of plates, hearing my worth reduced to a number. I didn't say a word. I smiled through the rest of the evening, served cake, and watched my daughter blow out candles under lights I once paid for later that night. I quietly packed my suitcase. No tears, no drama, just silence. On the kitchen counter, I left a note. It said, "Thank you for letting me stay. Don't worry, I won't be your burden anymore." I took the 6 a.m. bus back to my old house, the one Thomas and I built when we had nothing but dreams and blueprints. Dust had settled everywhere, but it still felt like home. I spent that first day scrubbing floors, watering dead plants, and realizing that solitude doesn't kill you. Disrespect does. The next few weeks passed quietly. Lydia called a few times, asking if I was okay. I said I was fine, always fine. I could hear the guilt in her voice, but I never mentioned the conversation I'd overheard. Some truths, when spoken aloud, destroy what little dignity remains. One evening, I went through Thomas's old files. Tucked between his papers was a folder marked land deeds. Among them was a property neither of us ever sold, a large piece of land outside the city, untouched for years. I smiled faintly. Thomas used to call it our future. Now, it felt more like closure. The next morning, I met with our lawyer, Mr. Collins, and transferred the ownership in my name alone. Not for profit, not for revenge, just as a reminder to myself that independence isn't about who you live with. It's about who you are when you're alone. Months passed. I built a new routine, morning walks, bookkeeping for my late husband's clients, tea by the window at sunset. The silence no longer hurt. It healed. And every night, when the clock ticked past midnight, I whispered to the empty air, "You called me a burden, Ethan, but someday you'll understand what real weight feels like, because life has a strange rhythm. It doesn't forget humiliation. It only waits for the right time to echo it back." Asterisk, do you ever wonder how pride can blind even the cleverest of men? Ethan always thought he was untouchable, a man who could bend the world to his will. But the world, it has a way of bending back, slowly, quietly, without fanfare. Before I go on, thank you for staying with me tonight. It means more than you know that someone, somewhere, is listening while the world outside carries on. If it's not too much to ask, could you tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you? Sometimes I like imagining that my story travels quietly into rooms across continents, touching lives silently like a gentle warning. After I left their house, life went on in ways that were invisible at first. Ethan continued his work at his corporate firm, Lydia supporting him as always. Though her smiles became tighter, her laughter slightly forced, I could hear about them occasionally. The occasional call from Lydia, polite, careful. "Mom, we hope you're well," she'd say, her voice holding a fraction of anxiety. I'd respond softly, never offering guidance, never judging. My silence became the shadow that followed them. Ethan's arrogance was his undoing. He always believed he could manipulate outcomes with charm, influence, and a well-timed smile. He didn't understand that respect, true respect, cannot be borrowed. It must be earned. And when you mock the person who built the foundation beneath you, life keeps score. 3 months after I returned home, the first cracks began. It was a Monday morning. I had just finished my tea, watching the soft sunrise paint the sky amber and rose. When my phone rang, Lydia's voice trembled. "Mom, Ethan's company. There's a problem." I didn't speak immediately. I waited, letting her collect herself. Finally, she said, "It's the Johnson account and the Carter contract. Payments were mismanaged. Vendors aren't being paid. Banks are calling. They're saying the firm might default." I nodded silently, not out of satisfaction. Never that. But because I knew the lesson was beginning. I didn't offer advice. I didn't speak. Ethan had built this empire on arrogance and shortcuts. Now he would have to live with it. Weeks passed. The calls became more desperate. Lydia's voice softened with fear each time she spoke to me. "Mom, we can't reach him. He's not answering clients. He's ignoring emails, ignoring notices. I don't know what to do." I only listened. Silence was the only power I could give him now. I didn't interfere. I let him stumble into the weight of his own mistakes. One evening, I received a letter at my door. No name, no return address, only the corporate seal from Ethan's firm. It was a legal notice. Their biggest client had withdrawn, citing non-payment and mismanagement. Suddenly, Ethan's perfectly controlled world, the world where I had been called a burden, was collapsing. And the irony, it lay quietly, waiting for him to notice. 2 months later, Lydia visited me. She came early, her eyes red from stress, her hands clutching files. "Mom," she said softly, almost whispering, I think he's finally realizing what it's like without someone to pick up after mistakes." I nodded. Some lessons are learned only when the weight falls entirely on your shoulders. I didn't ask what happened behind closed doors. I didn't pry. I only allowed the rhythm of life to unfold. The way frost spreads slowly across a window pane before it shatters. Ethan's office calls became frantic. Suppliers were walking away. Partners were filing lawsuits. The firm's reputation, built painstakingly over years, began to crumble. And each day, Lydia's tone shifted. She no longer defended him. She no longer laughed at his arrogance. The man who once mocked me, who made me feel small in his house, now discovered that the real world doesn't forgive bluster. Then came the day when he needed me. I had received no prior warning. A young man in a sleek suit arrived at my door, briefcase in hand, polite but firm. "Mrs. Ward," he asked, handing me documents. I raised an eyebrow. "We represent Mr. Ethan Harris, his firm. He requires immediate use of your property at Maple Grove Lane for collateral and project licensing. They say only your signature can authorize this." I smiled faintly. The quietest sound a storm contained. The irony of it. The man who once called me a financial burden, now standing outside my door, waiting for my consent to salvage his empire, was almost poetic. I asked the young man to sit. "Tell him," I said, "that Mrs. Ward will consider his request. But he must understand. Respect, once lost, cannot be borrowed back. It must be earned." It took 3 days for him to respond. 3 days in which I received multiple calls, messages, and finally a timid knock on my front door. Ethan himself, his suit impeccable, his eyes wide with something unfamiliar, humility. "Mrs. Ward," he began, voice low. I didn't know. I didn't interrupt. I didn't smile. I only waited, he continued. I mismanaged everything. I didn't realize how much you handled, how much you carried. And he faltered. And that's when I spoke. "Ethan," I said softly, my tone calm but absolute. "I never asked for your admiration. I never wanted it. But you chose to belittle me, to call me a burden. And now, you understand what true weight feels like." He swallowed, eyes fixed on the floor. I'm sorry, Eleanor. Please, if you can, help me. I let him wait. I made him feel the weight of the hours, the days, the weeks he had spent ignoring the one person who had built the foundation beneath him. He squirmed in silence, and it was perfect. When I finally agreed to sign the papers, a legal formality only, I did so on my terms. I added a clause ensuring Lydia's position in the company would be protected, and that Ethan would bear full financial accountability for past mismanagement. He had no choice. He had to swallow pride, acknowledge mistakes, and finally see the value of what he had once dismissed. After signing, he looked at me, voice shaking. Thank you for this, for not completely destroying me. I smiled faintly. I didn't destroy you, Ethan. Life did. I only made sure you learned the lesson personally, without shortcuts, without excuses. The first true silence fell between us. Not awkward, not strained, but complete. It was the silence that speaks louder than words. He realized then the depth of arrogance, the fragility of power when unearned, the necessity of humility before respect. Weeks turned into months. Ethan's empire stabilized, but differently, more cautiously, more respectfully. He began consulting Lydia openly, taking her opinions seriously, and acknowledging the efforts of everyone around him. And the quietest victory of all, he no longer underestimated the women in his life. I continued my days quietly in my house, tending to the land Thomas and I built, sipping tea as I watched sunsets that painted the sky with gold. Sometimes I received calls from Lydia, updates on the company, or Ethan humbly asking advice I no longer freely gave. And each time, I smiled softly, knowing the lesson had finally settled. Because pride, when left unchecked, always finds its mirror, and respect, when denied, finds its rightful place, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the very hands that were once dismissed. That evening, as rain streaked the windows and shadows of night began to stretch across the floors, I whispered to myself, "You once called me a burden, Ethan. Now you know. Weight is only real when you carry it yourself." And somewhere, deep in the quiet spaces of the world, I felt a measure of peace. Not triumph, not malice, but the calm satisfaction of life balancing the scales. Of justice, silent, unhurried, absolute. Asterisk, do you ever stop and think about how the quietest lessons are often the most powerful? How the most devastating truths sometimes arrive softly, without fanfare, without warning, and yet leave a mark no one can ignore? Before I begin tonight, thank you, truly, for choosing to spend a piece of your time with me. If it's not too much to ask, may I know where you're listening from, and what hour it is for you? Because for me, it's the kind of hour when the world hangs between night and dawn, when everything feels possible, yet fragile. It was during such an hour, months after Ethan had learned the weight of his mistakes, that the final chapter began to write itself. And it began quietly, like a shadow stretching across the edge of the room before sunrise. Ethan had rebuilt his company slowly, painfully, but pride, the same pride that had once led him to dismiss me, to call me a burden, never dies quietly. It simmers, it festers, and it waits for opportunity. He had been summoned to a corporate gala, an event celebrating emerging entrepreneurs, investors, and acquisitions. The same arena that once would have applauded him for his bravado now brimmed with eyes. That measured influence, not charm. Ethan was nervous. I could hear it in Lydia's voice when she called me the night before. "Mom," she whispered over the line, her tone almost conspiratorial. "He's anxious." I've never heard him like this. Something about this event. It's important. I smiled faintly. Good. Let him feel what true weight feels like, one more time. And that's exactly what he would. The gala was magnificent. Chandeliers glimmered like frozen stars, reflecting polished floors where the elite of the business world glided gracefully. Waiters moved like shadows carrying crystal flutes filled with champagne. Conversations hummed with strategy, opportunity, ambition. Ethan walked in, confident on the surface, but trembling underneath. I watched from a quiet corner, my presence unnoticed, my eyes steady. He believed the event was about showcasing his comeback, about reminding investors, clients, and peers that he was still relevant. What he didn't know was that the stage had been quietly prepared for a different revelation. The MC's voice rose, smooth and commanding. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate not only innovation and perseverance but integrity, the kind that withstands trials, tests, and time. And now, please welcome the visionary leading H&G Enterprises. The hall buzzed. Investors leaned forward. Phones were lifted. Conversations halted. And then, the name, Mrs. Eleanor Ward. Time froze. Ethan's hands twitched around the glass he held. His jaw tightened. Lydia's eyes widened in astonishment. I stepped forward onto the stage, calm, composed, dressed in deep navy, a color that whispered authority and quiet command. Pearls around my neck caught the light but did not shine brighter than the presence I carried. The room erupted in polite applause, followed by genuine awe as my reputation, long-standing and carefully built, filled the space. I spoke softly, measured, deliberate. My journey began decades ago, not with wealth, but with resolve. I built my career, my life, and my family on diligence, on integrity, and on respect, the kind that cannot be borrowed, bought, or assumed. Eyes followed me, but I did not look at Ethan immediately. He was pale now, lips parted as if he might speak, but words failed him. The irony of the moment weighed heavily in the silence between us. Some people believe that success is measured by loudness, by visibility, by who can shout the longest. I continued, voice steady, carrying across the room without strain. But real success, I said, letting the words hang like mist, grows quietly. It flourishes in patience, in preparation, in wisdom earned through mistakes. And then I finally looked at him. Ethan, once proud, once dismissive, once my greatest challenger. He flinched, the subtle shift in his expression betraying recognition, guilt, and the bitter taste of irony. You see, I said, softly, almost conversational, there are lessons no amount of instruction can teach. They are learned through experience, through consequence, through the weight of one's own decisions. The room absorbed every word. Investors, entrepreneurs, journalists, all witnessed what they could not ignore. I did not need to humiliate him. I did not need to shame him publicly. The quiet truth of my presence, the undeniable authority of my achievements, the calm assurance of my silence through his missteps, that was enough. Ethan's knees felt weak. He did not move. He did not speak. His empire, rebuilt with sweat and ambition, felt fragile beneath him, like a house built on sand when the tide was rising. I concluded, tonight, H&G Enterprises officially merges under my ownership, not to punish, but to preserve integrity, to honor the work, the effort, and the principles that build something lasting. And in doing so, we remind ourselves, respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned, and silence often speaks louder than the loudest proclamation. Polite applause swelled, then genuine admiration. The room was filled with murmurs, some of surprise, some of awe. Ethan stood frozen, His pride had no refuge. His authority, once absolute in his own mind, now belonged to the reality he had underestimated, and to me. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and the event's glitter softened into subdued conversations, I stepped down from the stage. I moved through the crowd with deliberate grace, pausing only when I reached Ethan and Lydia. He looked at me, swallowing hard. "Eleanor," I raised a finger, gentle but firm. "Do not speak yet. Listen. This is your lesson, not mine to repeat." Lydia's hand found mine, tentative, grateful. "You taught him," she whispered, without even saying it. I nodded. He finally understood. Humility is not gifted. Respect is not coerced. And power, when misused, always returns in unexpected ways. Ethan's voice cracked, finally breaking the silence. I don't know what to say." I did not answer immediately. I let the tension linger, the irony settle. Then, softly, deliberately, "You do not need to say anything. Actions, responsibility, and acknowledgement. These are the words that matter now." He exhaled. A sound of defeat and understanding rolled into one. For the first time, he truly recognized the depth of my role in the foundation he had taken for granted. And for the first time, he felt powerless in a way that would teach him humility forever. Weeks passed. Ethan rebuilt his reputation cautiously, consulting Lydia and his team with sincerity, acknowledging their contributions openly. He learned, painfully, that shortcuts lead only to temporary victories. Lydia, who had watched silently as I orchestrated the quiet justice, finally smiled with relief. "Mom," she said one evening over tea, "he's learning. He's changing." I smiled, not with triumph over him, but with satisfaction that life, in its own precise timing, had balanced the scales. "You'll see," I said softly, "some lessons cannot be rushed, some truths cannot be shouted. They arrive quietly, like dawn breaking over a long, dark night." And it was then that the final irony settled into place. The man who once called me a burden, who dismissed my wisdom, who believed I could be ignored, had finally learned, power is fragile, pride is heavier than any responsibility, and respect, once lost, can only be reclaimed through quiet acknowledgement, not demand. Months later, at a smaller industry conference, I spoke again. Ethan was there, not as a rival, not as a conqueror, but as a changed man. He listened from the audience, humility replacing arrogance. I did not need to remind him of the past. The memory lived in him, quietly, persistently. After the talk, he approached, not with defiance, not with pleading, but with measured gratitude. "Eleanor," he said softly, "thank you for everything." I placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of calm authority. "You are welcome, Ethan, not for me, but for yourself, to understand, finally, the value of what you ignored." And there it was, the final, cinematic truth of it all. Justice had arrived, not as spectacle, not as vengeance, not as humiliation. It had arrived quietly, elegantly, through strategy, patience, and the unwavering weight of experience. Sometimes, the loudest lessons are silent. Sometimes, the strongest justice arrives not with swords or shouts, but with calm, deliberate presence and measured action. And sometimes, the sweetest victory is not seeing someone fall. It is witnessing them stand again, differently, wiser, humbled. That night, I returned home. The rain had begun, soft at first, then heavier, washing the streets and the world in quiet gray. I poured tea, the steam curling like whispers of memory, and sat by the window. Outside, lights flickered, shadows moved, life went on. Inside, I felt the balance restored. Ethan had learned humility. Lydia had learned strength. And I had reminded the world that power, respect, and wisdom do not demand recognition. They command it quietly, with patience, with integrity, and with the undeniable force of truth. And as I watched the rain streak the glass, I whispered softly into the stillness, "You once believed I was a burden, Ethan. Now, you carry the weight of knowing who built the world you walk in. And the quiet truth is heavier than you imagined. Sometimes, life doesn't need to shout. Sometimes, it simply waits, lets the storm pass, and then shows who truly stands tall. Because silence is not the absence of power. It is the proof of it. Even that, my dear listener, is the story of how pride was humbled, lessons were learned, and justice, quiet, elegant, absolute justice, finally arrived.